Her 67-year-old grandmother lies beaten to death on her pantry floor, her head in a pool of blood, a rug draped over her face like someone couldn't bear to look at what they'd done. And the killer walks free for 18 years, while his own mother watches him spiral into heroin addiction, knowing full well he's a murderer. And here's the thing that'll make your blood run cold. He lived right across the street the entire time, waving to neighbors, watching the police tape go up, attending the vigil, all while his mother fed investigators lies to keep her boy out of prison. And when he finally died of an overdose in 2003, she kept that secret for another 12 years. 12 more years of a family not knowing. 12 more years of a neighborhood living with a question mark. 12 more years of justice denied. And you know what the worst part is? The absolute gut punch of this whole thing. When they finally cracked it in 2015, there was nobody left to arrest, nobody to prosecute, nobody to look in the eye and ask why. Just a dead junkie and his guilty mother protected by a statute of limitations that ran out years before she finally opened her mouth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. January 25th, 1997, Denver's Crestmore neighborhood, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and knew everyone's name. And Searle Goldfogle was the heart of it all, descended from Denver pioneer families. Her late husband, Leon, had built a business empire with Ace Mercantile Company. Imperial Distribution, Craig Distribution, the kind of legacy names you see on old buildings downtown, and Searle herself was everywhere in that community, volunteering at Rose Medical Center, active in the Jewish community, fiercely independent despite the asthma that forced her to cart around an oxygen tank everywhere she went. And she had this habit that worried her family, but they couldn't break her of it. She liked doing things on her own schedule, which meant late-night grocery runs, midnight errands in her new brown and black Lincoln Continental, driving around Denver at hours when most 67-year-olds were deep in sleep. Her sister had talked to her late that Friday night. They'd made plans for Saturday, going to get their hair done together. Just a normal conversation between siblings who'd known each other their whole lives. No indication that anything was wrong, no sense that in just a few hours everything would shatter. And when Searle didn't show up for that hair appointment the next day, her sister knew immediately something was catastrophically wrong, because Searle wasn't the type to just not show up. She was reliable, she was punctual, and that growing pit of dread in her sister's stomach turned out to be absolutely justified, because when she drove to 57 South Jasmine Street and walked into that house, she found a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The police report is clinical in its language, but you can read the horror between the lines. Officers arrived around 3 p.m. on January 25th to find Searle's body on the pantry floor, her head in that puddle of blood. Someone had covered her head with a rug, which investigators initially thought might be an attempt to show remorse, but later realized was probably just panic. The medical examiner would determine she died from blunt force trauma to both the head and chest, beaten so severely that her injuries told a story of frenzied violence. Not a planned execution, but something that spiraled out of control fast. And the house itself told another story. A sliding bathroom window had been jimmied open, the intruder's entry point clearly visible. Searle's bedroom had been ransacked, drawers pulled out and dumped, and from her dresser, a brown wood-grain jewelry box with a gold Star of David on the lid was missing, along with whatever other small valuables the thief could grab. The timeline constructed by investigators suggested Searle had gone grocery shopping late that night, probably after midnight given her habits, and while she was gone, someone had broken in through that bathroom window. Probably a burglar who'd been watching the house and knew an elderly woman lived alone, knew about her late-night habits, thought they had plenty of time to grab whatever they wanted and disappear. Except Searle came home earlier than expected, walked in with her groceries, and surprised the intruder mid-theft. And in that moment of mutual shock when the burglar realized he'd been caught, and Searle realized there was someone in her house. Everything went wrong. The burglar panicked. Searle had probably recognized him since he lived across the street, and he made a split-second decision that would destroy multiple lives. He attacked her with devastating force, beat her to death right there in her own home, then fled through the garage door, leaving her body on that pantry floor. The Denver Police Department mobilized immediately, and when I say mobilized, I mean they threw everything at this case. Formed a task force of 35 detectives and officers because burglars who kill are rare and therefore extremely dangerous. Police Chief David Michaud said it himself at the time. A burglar who escalates to murder is someone who'll do it again. Someone who needs to be caught before they strike again. And the FBI got involved too because of the profile they were building. They were looking for a short-tempered loner in his mid-20s. Someone with a history of petty crime, probably. Someone local who knew the neighborhood patterns. And they arrested 20 suspects who fit that profile over the following weeks and months. 20 different men brought in for questioning. Their lives turned upside down, their DNA taken, their alibis checked and rechecked, and every single one of them cleared. Not one of them connected to the murder. The neighborhood was terrified, and rightfully so, because if police couldn't identify the killer, that meant he was still out there, still walking those same streets, still capable of doing it again. And Searle had been such a fixture in Crestmore that her murder felt personal to everyone. This wasn't some random crime in a bad part of town. This was their neighbor, their friend, someone they'd chatted with at the grocery store and seen at community events, murdered in her own home in the middle of the night. And if it could happen to Searle Goldfogel, it could happen to anyone. So people started locking their doors, started being more careful about their routines, started looking at their neighbors with new suspicion because maybe one of them knew something, maybe one of them had seen something, maybe one of them was hiding something. And here's where the story gets its first twist, because 20-year-old Jonathan Clinton was interviewed by police just days after the murder. Brought in because he lived right across the street with his grandmother, because he'd been seen in the area, because he fit certain aspects of the profile. And when they sat him down in that interrogation room, he broke down crying, denied any involvement, seemed genuinely distraught about what had happened to the nice lady across the street. And then he took a polygraph test and passed it clean. And on top of that, he gave investigators 4 names of other people he said had been committing burglaries in the neighborhood. Actually helped the investigation by pointing them toward these other suspects, and his mother backed up his story. Said he'd been home with her that night, gave him an ironclad alibi. So police thanked him for his cooperation and moved on to other leads. Filed him away as a concerned neighbor who tried to help, never suspecting that they'd just let a murderer walk out of that interrogation room. Those 4 names Jonathan gave up, those supposed burglars he threw under the bus. Police tracked them down and interviewed them too. And every single one of them told the same story. Jonathan Clinton was the burglar. Jonathan was the one who'd been breaking into houses all over Crestmore for months. Jonathan was the one stealing jewelry and electronics and whatever else he could fence. And his mother Jill Clinton was his fence. She was the one taking the stolen goods and selling them or trading them for heroin, because both mother and son were deep in addiction. And this information should have been a massive red flag. Should have brought Jonathan back in for another round of questioning. Should have destroyed that alibi his mother had given him. But somehow it didn't. Somehow the investigation moved in other directions. Somehow Jonathan Clinton remained just another witness instead of becoming the prime suspect he should have been. The case went cold, not because investigators stopped caring, but because they'd exhausted every lead they had, run down every tip, interviewed every possible suspect, tested every piece of DNA evidence with the technology available in the late 90s. And come up empty, they had physical evidence from the scene. That window, that screen, cigarette butts that might have belonged to the killer. The rug that covered Searle's head, the towel found nearby, but none of it pointed to anyone specific. And without a match in the DNA databases, without a confession, Without a witness who'd seen something useful, the trail went cold, and Searle's family was left with nothing but questions and grief. 7,000 sunrises, as they'd later describe it, 7,000 mornings waking up, not knowing who killed their mother, their sister, their grandmother. 7,000 days of wondering if the killer was still out there, walking around free, maybe still in the neighborhood, maybe someone they passed on the street. Jonathan Clinton self-destructed slowly, and then all at once the way addicts often do. His heroin use escalated from recreational to all-consuming. His life became a cycle of using and stealing to support using and using more. His relationship with his mother grew increasingly toxic as she enabled him, while also growing, to resent what he'd become. And neighbors watched this young man deteriorate in real time. Saw him getting thinner, saw him acting more erratic, saw the police showing up at his grandmother's house for various disturbances, and some of them, quite a few of them actually, suspected he might have had something to do with Searle's murder. There was something about his behavior after that night, something about the way he'd acted when questioned, something that just felt off. But suspicion without evidence is just gossip, and police had cleared him, so people kept their thoughts to themselves mostly, mentioned it in hushed conversations over fences, but never made a formal statement, never pushed the issue. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2003, 6 years after Searle's murder, Jonathan Clinton died of a heroin overdose, 26 years old. His body found in circumstances that were predictable and tragic and entirely avoidable. And his death should have been just another statistic in America's opioid crisis. Another young person gone too soon, another family grieving an addict they couldn't save. But his death was something else entirely. It was a murderer escaping justice. It was evidence being destroyed. It was answers dying with him. And his mother, Jill Clinton, knew all of this. Knew that her son had killed Searle Goldfogle, had known it since the night it happened, when Jonathan came home and told her what he'd done. And she said nothing, attended her son's funeral and buried him with that secret. Let the Goldfogle family continue to suffer, not knowing, while she grieved her own loss. And the really infuriating part is she could have come forward then, could have given that family closure, could have cleared her conscience, but she chose silence. Chose to protect a dead man's reputation over living people's need for answers. Detective Troy Bisgard inherited the Goldfogle case the way cold case detectives inherit most of their work, by choice and by obsession, because you don't end up working cold cases unless you're the type who can't let go of unsolved puzzles, the type who sees a file gathering dust on a shelf and thinks about the real people behind that paperwork. The families still waiting for answers, the killers still walking free. And Bisgard looked at Searle Goldfogle's case and saw 18 years of a family in limbo. 18 years of a killer potentially still out there. 18 years of justice delayed, and he decided that was 18 years too long. So he did what good cold case detectives do. He started from scratch. Read every single page of the original investigation. Interviewed everyone who'd been interviewed before. Looked at every piece of evidence with fresh eyes and newer technology. And he kept coming back to one name that should have been pursued more aggressively back in '97, Jonathan Clinton. The problem was Jonathan Clinton was dead, and you can't prosecute a corpse, can't put a dead man on trial, can't give a family the satisfaction of looking their loved one's killer in the eye and hearing a guilty verdict read aloud in a courtroom. But Bisgard believed in the truth mattering even when justice wasn't possible anymore. Believed that families deserved to know what happened, even if there would never be a trial. And he started digging into Jonathan Clinton's life, his criminal history, his known associates, his family, and the more he dug, the more convinced he became that Jonathan was the guy. Everything pointed to him, the timeline, the proximity, the motive, the known burglaries, the suspicious behavior, the alibi that fell apart under scrutiny. All of it screamed guilty, but conviction without confession. or ironclad evidence is just theory, and Biscard needed more. Then the tips started coming in, and here's where human nature gets interesting, because people who know things about murders tend to carry that knowledge like a weight. It sits on them. It changes how they interact with the world. It comes out in whispered conversations and drunken confessions and deathbed revelations. Secrets have this way of not staying secret forever because guilt and conscience and the simple human need to tell someone something important eventually override fear and loyalty. And starting around 2013, more than a decade after Jonathan's death, people who'd known him and his mother started reaching out to police with variations of the same story. Jill Clinton knew what her son had done. Jill had told people over the years that Jonathan killed Searle Goldfogle. Jill had admitted to providing a false alibi. Jill had hidden her son in hotels after the murder to keep him away from police questioning. Jill had been living with this knowledge for 16 years, and it was eating her alive. One tipster said they'd had conversations with both Jill and Jonathan's grandmother where it came up that Jonathan was responsible for Searle's death. Said they were both heroin addicts at the time. These conversations happened so maybe their guard was down. Maybe the drugs made them careless with secrets. Maybe they just needed to tell someone and figured another addict wouldn't go to the police. And for years they were right. Whoever heard these admissions kept them quiet. But time has this way of changing people's calculations about what's right and what's loyalty. And eventually someone decided the Goldfogle family deserved to know the truth, more than Jill Clinton deserved to keep her secret. So they called the Denver Police Department and laid it all out. Said Jill knows, said she's always known. Said if you press her hard enough, she'll tell you everything. Biscard and Commander Ronsonier, who'd been with the case since the beginning and refused to let it be buried and forgotten. They approached Jill Clinton with this new information, brought her in for questioning. And here's what you need to understand about interrogating someone who's been carrying a secret for almost 2 decades. They're tired. They're worn down by the weight of it. Part of them wants to confess just to be free of the burden. But another part of them is still loyal to the memory of their dead child. Still wants to protect that person even though there's nothing left to protect anymore. So the interrogation became this delicate dance of pushing and pulling, confronting her with what they knew while giving her room to admit what they suspected. And eventually, finally, after 18 years of lying, Jill Clinton broke. She told them everything. Told them how Jonathan came home that night in January 1997 and confessed to her what he'd done. Told her he'd broken into the Goldfogle house through that bathroom window, planning to steal jewelry and whatever else he could grab. Told her Searle came home unexpectedly and caught him in the act. Told her he'd panicked because she knew who he was. Lived right across the street and could identify him easily. Told her he'd punched her and she fell to the ground. And in that moment of complete panic and rage and fear of going to prison, he kept hitting her. Kept beating her until she stopped moving, and then he grabbed what he could and ran. Came home to his mother covered in another woman's blood and terror and asked her to help him. And she did. She chose her son over the truth. Chose protecting him over justice for their neighbor. Made that choice in a split second and then had to live with it for 18 years. Jill admitted she'd lied to police when they interviewed her in the days after the murder. Said Jonathan was home with her that night when he absolutely wasn't. Said he couldn't have done it because he was with her. Gave him that alibi, knowing full well it was false. Knowing she was obstructing a murder investigation. Knowing she was letting a killer walk free. And then when Jonathan was interviewed and broke down crying, denying involvement. When he took that polygraph test and somehow passed it. Probably because he'd convinced himself of his own innocence the way pathological liars can. His mother backed his story up, doubled down on the lie. Told investigators multiple times that her son was home that night. Couldn't possibly have been involved, and because she seemed credible. Because she had no apparent reason to lie. Because mothers are generally presumed to be telling the truth about their children's whereabouts. Police believed her and moved on. But Jill's help didn't stop with that initial false alibi. She went further. hid Jonathan in various hotels around Denver to keep him away from police who might want to ask follow-up questions, moved him from place to place so he wouldn't be easily found, essentially helped him evade further questioning during those crucial early days of the investigation when memories are freshest and lies are hardest to maintain. And she acted as his fence for the burglaries, took the items he stole, including things he'd taken from Searle's house that night, and sold them or traded them for heroin, became an active participant in his criminal enterprise. And all of this, every single bit of it, was obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact. Multiple felonies that should have sent her to prison for years. But here's the cruel twist that makes this story even more frustrating. The statute of limitations had run out. Colorado law at the time said you had 3 years to charge someone as an accessory after the fact to a felony. 3 years from when the crime occurred, which meant the clock ran out in 2000, 3 years after Searle's murder. And even though Jill continued lying and covering up for years after that, even though she maintained that false alibi well into the 2000s, the original act of obstruction happened in 1997, and by the time she confessed in 2015, the statute of limitations had long since expired. She couldn't be charged, couldn't be prosecuted, couldn't be held legally accountable for derailing a murder investigation and letting a killer go free. And District Attorney Mitch Morrissey was livid about it, said publicly that Jill Clinton had basically derailed the entire investigation, had helped a murderer avoid accountability, had caused immeasurable pain to the Goldfogle family by forcing them to live with uncertainty for 18 years, and there was nothing he could do about it legally. Absolutely nothing. She was going to walk away without facing any criminal consequences. The press conference announcing the case had been solved was this bittersweet mixture of closure and frustration. Morrissey standing at the podium with Bisgard and Sonia beside him, explaining to reporters and to the Goldfogle family that they'd identified Searle's killer as Jonathan Clinton, that they had a confession from his mother confirming what happened that night, that they'd solved the case definitively. But there would be no trial, no conviction, no one going to prison. The killer was dead, and his accomplice was protected by the statute of limitations. And you could see the mixed emotions in the room. Relief at finally knowing the truth, mixed with anger that there would be no real justice. Gratitude for the detectives who never gave up, mixed with bitterness about how long it took and how many people had to fail before the truth came out. The Goldfogle family released a statement that was remarkably gracious considering what they'd been through. Said they were eternally grateful to the detectives who'd worked the case. Said they appreciated everyone who'd come forward with information. Said that 18 years was a brutally long time to live with pain and uncertainty. Nearly 7,000 sunrises they counted. And every single one of those mornings was tainted by loss and grief they couldn't reconcile. The uncertainty was daunting, and the senseless brutality was unimaginable. Time and circumstance had erased the chance for real justice, so all that was left was whatever solace and closure came, with finally knowing the truth. And they made a point of saying there were those who knew and stayed silent, which only served to generate more pain for an already raw and tattered family. A clear reference to Jill Clinton and anyone else who'd known Jonathan was guilty but kept quiet about it. The neighborhood reaction was interesting because, while some people expressed relief that the case was solved, a lot of long-time Crestmore residents said they'd suspected Jonathan all along. Said they'd told each other for years that he probably did it. Said there was something about his demeanor after the murder that felt off. Said they'd watched him deteriorate into addiction and wondered if guilt was part of what destroyed him. And now they were angry that their instincts had been right, but nobody had taken those suspicions seriously. Angry that police had cleared him based on his mother's false alibi and a polygraph test that somehow he passed. Angry that he'd been living right there across the street for years after killing their neighbor, and nobody had stopped him. One anonymous neighbor told reporters they didn't understand why it took so long for closure to happen. Said it had been so many years now since the murder, and you could hear the frustration in their voice. The sense that this should have been solved decades earlier. The polygraph test that Jonathan passed became a major point of discussion among investigators and forensic psychologists because polygraphs are famously unreliable, which is why they're not admissible in court. They measure physiological responses like heart rate and blood pressure and perspiration that correlate with stress but can't actually detect lies. And some people can pass them even when lying, especially if they're sociopaths who don't feel normal guilt or anxiety, especially if they've convinced themselves of their own story, especially if they're high on drugs that alter their physiological responses. And Jonathan was a heroin addict who'd just committed his first murder, who was probably in shock, who'd had his mother tell him everything would be okay if he just stayed calm and denied everything. So he sat in that chair hooked up to those sensors and lied his way through the test, and the machine said he was telling the truth, and that false negative helped him avoid suspicion for 18 years. The 4 names Jonathan gave police during that initial interview, those supposed burglars he threw under the bus to deflect attention from himself, that was a classic guilty person's move. Trying to be helpful to investigators, while actually steering them away from the real suspect, giving them other people to focus on and investigate and waste time on. And it worked. Police ran down those leads, interviewed those 4 individuals, and while they confirmed Jonathan was actually the burglar in the neighborhood, somehow that information didn't circle back around to make Jonathan himself a prime suspect. There was a disconnect somewhere in the investigation. Information that should have triggered a more intensive look at Jonathan got filed away instead. And you have to wonder if things had been handled differently in those early days. If detectives had been more skeptical of his mother's alibi. If they'd pressed harder on the fact that his supposed victims were all saying he was the burglar. Would they have broken the case in 1997 instead of 2015? Would Searle's family have gotten closure? Before so many birthdays and holidays and milestones passed without answers, Jonathan's spiral into fatal addiction raises questions about whether guilt over the murder contributed to his self-destruction, whether killing Searle Goldfogle ate away at him even as his mother tried to help him forget it, whether every time he shot up he was trying to numb not just the physical craving for heroin, but also the psychological weight of having beaten an elderly woman to death. We'll never know because he never admitted it to anyone except his mother, as far as we know. Never confessed to friends or fellow addicts, never wrote it down, never sought help for the trauma of having killed someone. Just carried it silently until the drugs killed him at 26. And maybe that was its own form of justice. Maybe the universe extracted payment for Searle's life by taking his. But that's cold comfort to a family that wanted their day in court, wanted to hear a judge sentence him, wanted the formal acknowledgement that what happened to their loved one was murder, and someone was being held accountable. The case highlighted major problems in how cold cases are investigated and how statutes of limitations work. Because if Jill Clinton had been facing criminal charges, she might have come forward earlier, might have confessed years before Jonathan died, might have given police the information they needed when it could still lead to an arrest and trial. But knowing she couldn't be charged removed any legal incentive to tell the truth. She could keep her silence indefinitely without consequences. And that's a perverse incentive structure that prioritizes protecting accessories over solving murders. Makes you wonder how many other cold cases could be solved if family members and friends who know the truth felt any pressure to come forward instead of being able to hide behind expired statutes of limitations. The Goldfogle case became a textbook example of why cold case units exist and why they matter. Because hot investigations are messy and chaotic, with leads coming in faster than detectives can process them. Witnesses whose memories are fresh, but whose stories conflict. Physical evidence that needs to be catalogued and tested with whatever technology exists at that moment. And sometimes crucial details get missed in the rush. Sometimes the right questions don't get asked. Sometimes the obvious suspect isn't obvious until years later, when you can look at the whole picture with fresh eyes and better tools. And that's exactly what happened here. The original 1997 investigation was thorough by the standards of the time, but it missed Jonathan Clinton. Let him slip through because his mother's alibi seemed solid, and his polygraph came back clean, and there were so many other leads to chase. But 18 years later, Detective Bisgard could look at that same evidence and see the gaps. See where the investigation should have pushed harder. See the red flags that got ignored. Denver's cold case unit operates under a motto that's both simple and profound. We will never forget. And that's not just marketing language. It's a philosophical commitment to the idea that every murder victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed. Every family deserves answers, even if those answers come decades late. Every killer needs to know that the clock never runs out on murder. There's no statute of limitations on homicide in Colorado, which means, theoretically, you could be arrested and charged 50 years after killing someone if they can prove you did it. And that's intentional. That's society saying some crimes are so heinous that we will never stop looking for the people who committed them. Time doesn't erase murder. Time doesn't forgive murder. Time just gives investigators new tools and new perspectives to solve murders that seemed unsolvable when they first happened. The Denver Integrated Cold Case Project started in 1999, just 2 years after Searle Goldfogel's murder, and it was revolutionary at the time because it brought together the Denver Police Department, the Denver District Attorney's Office, and the Denver Police Crime Laboratory in a coordinated effort to systematically review old cases using new DNA technology that was rapidly evolving. Dr. Gregory LaBerge, who helped create the project, was working as an analyst at the crime lab when he started using a new database to connect DNA samples to suspects. And he didn't expect success on his first try, but he got it. Matched DNA from an old case to a suspect in the system, and suddenly realized they were sitting on hundreds of cases that could potentially be solved if they just went back and retested evidence with better technology. So the project was born out of that realization, out of the understanding that science had advanced faster than justice, and there was a whole backlog of solvable crimes waiting for someone to give them attention. By the end of 2024, the cold case project marked 25 years of operation, and the statistics are staggering. They've re-examined approximately 900 sexual assault cases and 240 homicide cases, brought criminal charges in more than 130 cases total, closed dozens more by identifying perpetrators who'd since died, used DNA and genetic genealogy and traditional investigative techniques and good old-fashioned detective work to bring closure to families who'd been waiting decades for answers. And every single one of those solved cases represents real people, real victims, real families who finally got to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. But it also represents more than 1,000 cases that remain unsolved. More than 1,000 families still waiting, still hoping, still living with that awful uncertainty that Searle Goldfogel's family lived with for 18 years. 1997 was a particularly violent year in Denver. The city saw 19 unsolved murders that year alone, according to data compiled years later. 19 separate cases where someone was killed and the killer was never identified or never arrested. 19 families left without closure. And Searle Goldfogel was just one of those 19. Her case wasn't unique in remaining unsolved. What made it eventually different was that it got solved, that Detective Bisgard refused to let it stay in that pile of cold cases, that Jill Clinton eventually broke her silence, that the truth came out even if justice couldn't be fully served. But what about the other 18 unsolved murders from that same year? What about the cases from every year before and since? Denver has hundreds of unsolved homicides going back decades, bodies in the system that represent lives cut short, and killers walking free and families in permanent limbo. Michael Connor's case from September 1997 is still unsolved today. He was 35 years old when someone stabbed him 92 times in his apartment near 28th and California in Denver's Five Points neighborhood. 92 stab wounds from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, which tells you this wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a quick murder during a burglary. This was personal, this was rage, this was someone who knew him and hated him, or someone who was completely deranged. And his niece Ambrosia said it years later when talking to reporters. Said she didn't see the point in stabbing someone 92 times. Nobody needs that many stab wounds to die. That's about something else. That's about fury or insanity or both. And 27 years later, his family is still waiting for answers. Still asking anyone who knows something to please come forward. Still believing that somebody saw something that night. Somebody knows something. Somebody's conscience might finally push them to make that call. The Goldfogel case proved that even cases that seem impossible to solve can crack open if the right pressure gets applied in the right place. If investigators refuse to give up, if witnesses finally decide to tell what they know, if family members who've been covering for killers decide the truth matters more than misplaced loyalty. And that's what makes cold case work simultaneously hopeful and heartbreaking. Hopeful because breakthroughs can happen decades after a murder when you least expect them. Heartbreaking because so many cases never get that breakthrough, never get that tip that changes everything, never get solved because the key witness died or moved away or decided their secret was going to the grave with them. And you're left with files full of evidence that points nowhere, and families who age into their grief until the people who most needed answers aren't around anymore to receive them. DNA technology revolutionized cold case investigation in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1997. Back then, DNA testing was expensive and slow and required relatively large samples and could only tell you if the DNA at a crime scene matched DNA from a known suspect. But now they can extract DNA from microscopic samples, from touch DNA on surfaces the killer barely made contact with, from degraded samples that sat in evidence rooms for decades, and they can use genetic genealogy to identify suspects, even if that person's DNA isn't in any criminal database. They build family trees using DNA matches from genealogy websites, where people voluntarily submit their genetic information hoping to find distant cousins. And investigators can work backward from those cousins to identify possible suspects. Then verify with traditional detective work. And suddenly, cases that were completely cold, no suspects at all, spring back to life with names and addresses and arrest warrants. The Golden State Killer case in California proved genetic genealogy worked on a massive scale. Joseph DeAngelo had committed at least 13 murders and 50 rapes across California in the 70s and 80s and got away with it for 40 years until investigators uploaded his DNA to GEDmatch, found distant relatives, built a family tree, narrowed down suspects, confirmed it was him through surveillance and discarded DNA, arrested him in 2018 when he was 72 years old. And suddenly every cold case unit in America realized they had a new weapon, a way to identify suspects who'd evaded justice for decades, a way to solve cases that seemed permanently unsolvable, and the floodgates opened. Cold cases started getting solved at a rate that was unimaginable just a few years earlier, and that technology is only getting better and cheaper and faster. Denver's been aggressive about adopting these new techniques. The cold case unit works with outside labs that specialize in genetic genealogy, sends them evidence from old cases, builds family trees for unidentified suspects, and has solved multiple cases this way, but it's resource-intensive and time-consuming and expensive. Each genetic genealogy investigation can take months and cost thousands of dollars, so they have to prioritize which cases get that treatment, usually focusing on homicides where they have good DNA evidence, but no matches in traditional databases. where they have families actively pushing for answers, where there's reason to believe the case is solvable if they can just identify the suspect. And every case they solve that way validates the approach, but also highlights how many more cases are waiting for that same level of attention. Ricky Dawson's name came up in the Denver Cold Case Project as a suspect in the 1996 murder of Terry Turachak, a 35-year-old woman found dead in her apartment, killed by strangulation and blunt force trauma to her head, and DNA evidence connected Dawson to the murder in 2004, but he was already in prison in Florida for a 2001 sexual assault and homicide. Was also accused of being involved in a homicide in Washington in 2000. This guy was a multi-state serial killer. And after further DNA testing and investigation, he was finally charged with Turachak's murder in 2023. 27 years after he killed her, he's due in court January 2025 for proceedings that will finally hold him accountable. And that delay, that almost 3-decade gap between murder and prosecution, that's not unusual in cold cases. That's actually pretty typical because of how long it takes to build airtight cases against suspects who've had years or decades to cover their tracks. Crespin Nene Perez took nearly 24 years to admit he murdered his girlfriend Bonnie Baker, who disappeared from her Denver home in 1998. She was 47 years old, and she just vanished. And for nearly a quarter century, her family didn't know if she'd run away, or been kidnapped, or been killed. Lived with that horrible not knowing that's somehow worse than knowing someone's dead, because at least death is final. At least you can grieve and move on. But when someone's missing, you're frozen in place. You can't mourn because they might still be alive somewhere. You can't move forward because hope keeps yanking you backward. And when Nene Perez finally pleaded guilty, it confirmed what the family probably suspected all along, but couldn't prove. Confirmed that Bonnie died decades ago, that they'd spent 24 years hoping for nothing, that the man they'd probably looked at with suspicion from the start really was the killer. The frustrating reality of cold case work is that solving a case doesn't always mean bringing someone to trial. Sometimes, like with Jonathan Clinton, the suspect is dead, and all you can do is confirm who did it and close the file. Sometimes, like with Jill Clinton, the accomplices are protected by statutes of limitations, and you can't charge them, even though they deserve to be charged. Sometimes suspects are identified, but they're old and sick, and the prosecution decides they're not competent to stand trial, or they're unlikely to survive long enough for the case to go to court. Sometimes you know who did it with moral certainty, but you can't prove it beyond reasonable doubt, which is the standard required for conviction. And those cases are agonizing for investigators, because they've done their job, they've solved the mystery. But the system can't deliver the verdict the family deserves. The Goldfogle family statement about there being people who knew and stayed silent, that's haunted cold case investigators because it's true in so many cases. There are always people on the periphery who know something, who heard something, who saw something, who were told something in confidence, and they make a calculation about whether to come forward, and usually they decide not to. They decide loyalty to a friend or family member matters more than justice for a stranger. They decide they don't want to get involved. They decide it's not their problem. They decide the victim is already dead, so what difference does it make? And that silence, that collective decision to prioritize their own comfort over someone else's desperate need for answers, that extends the suffering of victims' families for years or decades, turns a solvable case into an unsolvable one. Lets killers walk free and potentially kill again. Mitch Morrissey, when he was Denver's district attorney, used the Goldfogle press conference to make an emotional appeal to anyone sitting on information about any crime, cold or recent. Said there are families still hurting, just like the Goldfogle family. Said there are people who know about horrible crimes, who could come forward and help solve them, begged them to do the right thing. And you have to imagine he was thinking about all those other unsolved cases sitting in file drawers, all those other families waiting for the call that never comes. All those other killers who got away with it because someone chose silence over truth, and his frustration was palpable. You could hear it in his voice when he talked about how Jill Clinton basically derailed an entire investigation and would face no consequences. How there were unfortunately two individuals who committed crimes in this situation. The horrible beating that Jonathan Clinton gave his victim in her own home, but also his mother who covered up for him. The emotional toll on cold case detectives is something that doesn't get discussed enough because they're swimming in tragedy every single day, reading files about people who were murdered years or decades ago, looking at crime scene photos of victims who'd be elderly now if they'd lived, talking to family members who've been waiting so long for answers that they've almost given up hope. And every case they solve is a victory, but it's also a reminder of how many they haven't solved yet, how many are still sitting there waiting, and they can't work them all simultaneously. They have to make brutal decisions about which cases to prioritize, which families get their attention this month, which murders get pushed to the back burner for now, and there's no good way to make those choices. No algorithm that tells you this murder matters more than that murder. So they follow leads and hunches and tips and try to maximize the number of cases they can solve with limited resources and unlimited tragedy. Commander Ron Saulnier's refusal to let the Goldfogle case be buried and forgotten represents something crucial about how cold cases actually get solved. Because the dirty secret of law enforcement is that most cold cases stay cold, not because they're unsolvable, but because nobody's actively working them. They sit in boxes, in evidence rooms, gathering dust, while detectives focus on fresh murders that have public pressure behind them, that have media attention, that have brass breathing down their necks demanding results. And old cases become orphans. Nobody's case, everybody's case, which means nobody's really working them with the intensity required to break them open. But when you get someone like Sonia who takes ownership, who treats a decades-old murder like it happened yesterday, who keeps pushing and digging and refusing to accept that the trail's gone cold, that's when breakthroughs happen. That's when families get answers. Bisgard's approach to reinvestigating the Goldfogle case shows you what modern cold case work actually looks like in practice. He didn't just read the file and follow up on old leads. He treated it like a brand new investigation, re-interviewed everyone who'd been interviewed in '97 to see if their stories changed, or if they remembered new details. Now that years had passed and the immediate fear or loyalty that might have kept them quiet had faded, he looked at Jonathan Clinton's entire criminal history from the time of the murder until his death to map out patterns of behavior that might have been relevant. He tracked down people who'd known Jonathan in the drug world, fellow addicts who might have heard him say something incriminating when he was high and his guard was down. And he cultivated sources, built relationships with people who might have third-hand information, created an environment where people felt comfortable coming forward with tips even years after the fact. The tips about Jill Clinton knowing what her son didn't come out of nowhere. They came because Bisgard and his team spent years building a network of informants and contacts in the community, letting people know the case was still active, that they still cared. That information would be received and protected. And eventually, that groundwork paid off when someone who'd heard Jill's drunken confessions or drug-fueled admissions decided enough time had passed, decided the Goldfogle family deserved to know, decided whatever loyalty they felt to Jill or to Jonathan's memory wasn't worth protecting anymore. And they made that call that changed everything, that gave Bisgard the leverage he needed to sit Jill down and get her to finally tell the truth. And without that tip, without that one person deciding to speak up, the case might still be unsolved today. Searle's family might still be wondering. The interrogation of Jill Clinton was undoubtedly a masterclass in getting someone to confess to something they've been hiding for 18 years. Because you can't just walk in and accuse them, can't come at them aggressively. That makes them shut down and lawyer up. You have to be strategic. You have to show them you already know enough that lying isn't going to work anymore. Show them the evidence and the tips and the witnesses you've cultivated. Show them that the truth is coming out whether they participate or not, and then you give them the opportunity to be the one who tells it, to have some control over the narrative, to explain why they did what they did. And for someone like Jill, who'd been carrying this secret for so long, who'd watched her son die and still kept quiet, who'd probably been eaten alive by guilt and fear and the impossibility of ever undoing what she'd done, that opportunity to finally tell someone, to have it all come out, must have been simultaneously terrifying and relieving, like lancing a wound that's been festering for years. When she finally broke and admitted everything, admitted the false alibi and hiding Jonathan in hotels and knowing he killed Searle Goldfogle, that confession didn't just solve the case. It revealed the multiple layers of betrayal involved. Because Jill didn't just betray the Goldfogle family by covering for her son. She betrayed her community that trusted her. She betrayed the justice system that was trying to solve a murder. She betrayed every other potential victim Jonathan might have hurt if he'd escalated further into violence. And she betrayed Jonathan himself in a weird way, because by protecting him from consequences, she enabled his self-destruction. Never forced him to face what he'd done, let him drown in addiction and guilt until it killed him. Maybe if she'd made him turn himself in back in '97, he'd have gone to prison, but he might also have gotten clean, might have gotten treatment, might still be alive today, serving his sentence but alive. And her choice to protect him cost him his life as surely as it cost Searle hers. The statement from the Goldfogle family about those 7,000 sunrises is one of the most devastating ways I've ever heard. Someone described living with an unsolved murder. Because we talk about time healing wounds, but time doesn't heal anything when you don't have answers. Time just stacks up, each day another layer of not knowing. Another morning waking up and remembering before you even open your eyes that someone you loved was murdered and you'll never know who did it or why. 7,000 mornings of that, 7,000 repetitions of that gut punch. And every single one of those days was made worse by the fact that Jill Clinton could have ended it. Could have given them answers, chose not to. Chose her dead son's reputation over their desperate need for closure. And you can hear the anger underneath the graciousness in their statement. The barely contained fury at the people who knew and stayed silent. The fact that Jonathan Clinton passed a polygraph test when he was clearly guilty should be a massive red flag about how we use polygraphs in investigations. Because they're not lie detectors, they're stress detectors. They measure physiological responses that correlate with lying, but also correlate with nervousness and anxiety and fear of being falsely accused, which means innocent people fail them all the time when they're nervous about being suspected, and guilty people pass them all the time when they're calm or sociopathic or high on drugs that suppress their stress responses. And yet, law enforcement still uses them as investigative tools. Still uses them to eliminate suspects or focus attention on suspects, still treats them as if they have scientific validity when the scientific consensus is that they don't. They're marginally better than chance at detecting deception, which makes them almost useless. And in this case, the polygraph result actively harmed the investigation by giving Jonathan Clinton a false sheen of credibility that helped him avoid suspicion. The 4 names Jonathan gave police, those supposed burglars he identified, that was textbook misdirection from someone who's read too many crime novels or watched too many detective shows and thinks they know how to manipulate an investigation. Because the logic is sound on paper, if you're trying to deflect suspicion from yourself, you act helpful. You give investigators other people to look at. You position yourself as someone who wants the crime solved, rather than someone who committed it. And it works surprisingly often, because detectives are inclined to trust witnesses who seem cooperative, who voluntarily provide information, who don't lawyer up immediately. And Jonathan played that role perfectly, broke down crying to show emotional distress, agreed to take a polygraph to show he had nothing to hide, gave up other names to show he wanted to help, and all of it was performance. All of it was calculated to get police looking anywhere except at him. The friends he named, who then told police that actually Jonathan was the burglar and his mother was his fence. That information should have been a massive break in the case. Should have immediately led to renewed focus on Jonathan and a much harder look at Jill's alibi, but somehow it didn't. Somehow the investigation fragmented, and that crucial detail got lost or deprioritized or filed away without the follow-up it deserved. And you have to wonder about the mechanics of that failure. Was it simple human error? Was it too much information coming in too fast for detectives to properly synthesize? Was it a failure of communication between different people, working different angles of the investigation? Was it confirmation bias, where once they'd eliminated Jonathan as a suspect based on the polygraph and the alibi, they subconsciously filtered out information that suggested he was actually guilty? Whatever the reason, it represents a systemic failure that cost the Goldfogel family 18 years of uncertainty. Ray Ojada's case from June 14th, 1997 shows another facet of how cold cases get solved and how random chance can be the difference between justice and perpetual mystery. Because Ojeda kidnapped a 15-year-old girl near Federal Boulevard and Holden Place, held her at gunpoint, took her to a secluded area near the South Platte River, sexually assaulted her, shot her in the head, threw her in the river, and somehow, miraculously, impossibly, she survived, walked half a mile to Interstate 270 and flagged down help. And despite having this survivor who could identify her attacker, despite having DNA evidence from the sexual assault examination, the case sat unsolved for 14 years because Ojada's DNA wasn't in the system, wasn't in CODIS. There was no match, and without a match you just have evidence that proves someone did it, but not who. And then, in 2011, Ojeda gets convicted of a felony marijuana charge in Texas. Nothing to do with the Denver case, just bad luck for him. And his DNA gets entered into CODIS as required for felony convictions. And boom, match 18 years after the crime. They suddenly know exactly who did it. And that's how fragile justice is. Ojeda walked free for 14 years after attempting to murder a teenager, not because investigators didn't try to catch him, but because he hadn't been convicted of a felony that would put his DNA in the database. And if he'd never gotten busted for marijuana in Texas, if he'd been convicted of a misdemeanor instead of a felony, if Texas didn't require DNA for felony convictions, he'd probably still be free today. Might have committed more crimes, might have killed someone else. And that 15-year-old girl who survived his attack might have lived her whole life never knowing her attacker had been identified. And it's pure chance, pure luck, that he made a mistake that led to a conviction, that led to DNA collection, that led to a match. And you have to imagine how many other cases are sitting unsolved right now, waiting for that same kind of random chance to break them open. How many rapists and murderers are one stupid mistake away from being identified, but until they make that mistake, they're ghosts. The DNA match. In the Ojeda case, also exonerated, 2 men who'd been identified as possible suspects, which highlights another critical function of DNA evidence in cold cases. It doesn't just identify guilty people, it clears innocent people, frees them from suspicion they might have been living under for years. And how many unsolved cases have innocent people attached to them? People the family suspects or the police looked at hard but couldn't quite prove anything. People who've been living under that cloud of maybe they did it for decades. And DNA could clear them definitively, but only if someone goes back and retests the evidence. Only if cold case units have the resources to work those cases. Only if the evidence still exists and is in good enough condition to produce a profile. And there are hundreds of cases sitting in evidence rooms right now where DNA could solve the question of who did it, but nobody's testing it because there aren't enough resources, aren't enough technicians, aren't enough prosecutors willing to take on a decades-old case. The Denver Cold Case Project's 25-year anniversary at the end of 2024, with more than 100 30 cases solved is simultaneously a massive achievement and a reminder of the scale of the problem. Because 130 solved cases out of 900 sexual assaults and 240 homicides reviewed means the overwhelming majority are still unsolved, means there are hundreds of victims and families still waiting, still hoping, still living with that uncertainty. And that's just Denver, just one city's cold cases. Extrapolate that across Colorado, across the United States, and you're talking about tens of thousands of unsolved murders. Hundreds of thousands of unsolved sexual assaults, millions of victims and family members living in that limbo, and the resources dedicated to solving cold cases are a tiny fraction of what gets spent on fresh cases. Which makes sense from a triage perspective. You work the cases where the trail is still warm, where witnesses are still alive and memories are fresh. But it also means cold cases become lower priority by definition. Means most of them will never get the intensive investigation they need to be solved. Dr. Gregory LaBerge's comment that these DNA advancements have resulted in cases being solved that would never have been resolved otherwise is both hopeful and sad. Hopeful because it means technology is giving us tools we didn't have before. So because it means without those tools, we'd have just accepted those cases as permanently unsolved. Would have told families, sorry, we tried our best. There's nothing more we can do, and they'd have had to live with that. Would have had to make peace with never knowing. And now suddenly we have these tools that can crack cases wide open, but they're expensive and time-consuming and require specialized expertise. And most jurisdictions don't have access to them consistently, don't have labs that can do genetic genealogy, don't have budgets that allow them to send evidence to outside labs, don't have prosecutors who understand how to present genetic genealogy evidence to juries. So there's this massive gap between what's technically possible and what's practically achievable in most places. The nature of cold case work means detectives develop this complex relationship with the dead. They spend months or years getting to know victims through photographs and witness statements and forensic evidence. They learn about their lives and their families and their dreams and the circumstances of their deaths. They carry these people with them, even though they never met them in life. And when they solve a case, it's personal. It's not just closing a file. It's delivering on a promise they made to someone they've come to care about. Someone who can't speak for themselves anymore. Someone who's depending on them to tell their story and identify their killer and make sure they're not forgotten. And when they can't solve a case, when they exhaust every lead and come up empty, that failure haunts them. That's another person they couldn't help, another family they couldn't give closure to, another killer who got away with it. And they carry that weight too. Part 5 of 5, Denver, 1997, cold case. Mile-high murder brought down low. The technological revolution in cold case investigation isn't just about DNA and genetic genealogy. It's about how we store and search and cross-reference information in ways that were impossible in 1997. Because back then, if you wanted to compare evidence from one case to evidence from another case, you literally had to pull physical files and read through pages of reports and hope you noticed connections. But now everything's digitized and searchable. You can type in a weapon type or a method or a geographic area or a victim profile and instantly see every case that matches those parameters. You can identify patterns that would have been invisible when each case lived in its own folder, in its own filing cabinet. And that computational power, multiplied by human intuition, is cracking cases that seemed random but were actually connected, linking crimes across jurisdictions, identifying serial offenders who moved around to avoid detection. And it's only going to get better as artificial intelligence gets integrated into investigative work. But technology is only as good as the humans deploying it and the resources allocated to using it. Because you can have the most sophisticated DNA analysis in the world, but if you don't have enough lab technicians to process the backlog, if evidence sits waiting months or years for testing, If jurisdictions can't afford to send samples to specialized labs, then that technology might as well not exist for those cases. And this is the brutal reality of criminal justice in America. Resources are finite and distributed unevenly. Wealthy jurisdictions, with tax bases that support well-funded police, departments and prosecutors' offices can afford to aggressively work cold cases with cutting-edge technology, while poor jurisdictions struggle to keep up with current crimes, let alone go back and solve old ones. And that inequality means justice becomes a function of geography and economics. Means whether your murdered loved one's case gets solved might depend on which side of a county line they died on. And that's fundamentally unjust, but it's the system we have. The Goldfogle case resolution in 2015 sparked conversations in Denver about what justice even means when the perpetrator is dead and can't be prosecuted. Because on one level the case is solved. They know who did it. They know how it happened. They know why it happened. The family has answers and can finally have some kind of closure. But on another level, there's no justice at all. No trial where evidence gets presented and a jury renders a verdict. No sentencing where a judge tells the killer what they did was heinous and society is punishing them for it. No prison time served as payment for a life taken. Jonathan Clinton escaped all of that by dying. And whether you believe in an afterlife where he faces some cosmic justice, or you're a materialist who thinks death is just oblivion, either way, he didn't face earthly consequences for beating a 67-year-old woman to death in her own home. And his mother, who helped him get away with it for 18 years, faced no consequences either. Walked away free and clear, and that sticks in your throat. That feels wrong on a visceral level, even as you intellectually understand why statutes of limitations exist. Statutes of limitations are designed to balance several competing interests. They protect defendants from being prosecuted based on stale evidence and faded memories and lost witnesses. They give people a chance to move on from past mistakes without living under the threat of prosecution forever. They force the state to act with urgency rather than sitting on charges indefinitely. And for most crimes, those justifications make sense. But murder is different. Murder is the one crime we've collectively decided is so serious that the limitations never expire. You can be prosecuted for murder 50 years after the fact if evidence emerges, because we've decided as a society that there's no moving on from taking someone's life. There's no statute of limitations on ending someone's existence. But we haven't extended that same reasoning to accessories after the fact. To people who help murderers evade justice. To people like Jill Clinton, who knew their son killed someone and actively obstructed the investigation. And maybe we should. Maybe there should be no statute of limitations on helping someone get away with murder. Because the harm to the victim's family, that uncertainty and lack of closure, that continues for as long as the truth stays hidden. The Goldfogle family's statement about those who knew and stayed silent wasn't just about Jill Clinton. It was about the broader culture of silence that surrounds so many crimes. The neighborhood code that says you don't snitch. The family loyalty that says you protect your own, even when your own has done something terrible. The fear of retaliation that keeps witnesses quiet. The apathy that says it's not my problem. And all of those forces combine to create this protective shell around criminals that makes solving crimes harder than it needs to be. Because in most murders, there are people beyond the immediate perpetrator who know something or suspect something or heard something. And if even a fraction of those people came forward, if they decided truth mattered more than their various reasons for staying quiet, clearance rates would skyrocket, families would get answers faster, and killers would know they couldn't count on people protecting them. But we can't force people to come forward, can't compel witnesses who aren't legally required to testify. So we're left with appeals to conscience and offers of anonymity through Crime Stoppers and rewards for information, and hoping that eventually someone's guilt or grief or sense of justice outweighs their reasons for silence. Commander, Sonia and Detective Bisgard became heroes to the Goldvogel family, not because they achieved perfect justice, but because they refused to forget, because they treated Searle like she mattered, because they worked an 18-year-old case with the same intensity they'd work a fresh murder. And that dedication is both inspiring and depressing. Inspiring because it shows what's possible when investigators truly care and refuse to give up. Depressing because it shouldn't require that level of extraordinary effort. It should be standard that cold cases get worked aggressively and systematically. But the reality is, most cold cases don't have a Sonia or a Bisgard championing them. Most cold cases have overworked detectives who'd love to work them, but have current cases piling up on their desks and only so many hours in a day. And the cold cases slip further down the priority list until they're basically abandoned, stored, but not actively investigated, waiting for someone to care enough to pull them off the shelf. The success of Denver's cold case project, with over 130 cases solved in 25 years, proves the model works. Proves that dedicating specific resources and personnel to cold cases produces results. Proves that systematic review of old evidence with new technology is worth the investment. And other jurisdictions have taken note, have started their own cold case units or task forces, have allocated funding for genetic genealogy and advanced DNA testing, have made solving old murders a priority instead of an afterthought. But it's still a drop in the bucket compared to the scale of the problem. Still a small percentage of cold cases getting serious attention, while the vast majority remain cold. And every year adds new unsolved murders to the pile. Every year produces new families joining the terrible club of people waiting for answers that may never come. And the question becomes, how do we as a society prioritize this? How much are we willing to spend on bringing closure to crimes from decades ago when there are current crimes demanding resources? There's an argument that cold cases should take precedence over many fresh cases because, by definition, they represent justice delayed, represent families who've been waiting years or decades, while families with recent losses are just starting their journey. And if we believe justice delayed is justice denied, then maybe we should be putting more resources into accelerating justice for those who've waited longest. But there's also an argument that fresh cases are more solvable. Trails are warmer, witnesses are available, evidence is less degraded, so resource allocation should prioritize where you can make the most impact. And both arguments have merit, which is why this is a genuinely hard problem without easy answers. Why every police chief and district attorney in the country is making difficult triage decisions about where to deploy limited resources. And those decisions have real consequences for real families. Like the Goldvogels, who waited 18 years while other cases got priority. The broader context of Denver's crime statistics makes the cold case problem even starker. Because the city has seen periods of high violence where murders were happening faster than they could be solved, particularly in the 70s through the 90s, when crack cocaine and gang violence drove homicide rates to unprecedented levels. And during those years, investigations were necessarily rushed. Detectives were juggling multiple cases simultaneously. Evidence processing was backlogged, and mistakes got made, leads didn't get followed up, witnesses didn't get interviewed thoroughly. And the result is a legacy of unsolved murders from that era. Hundreds of cases where the original investigation was inadequate, not because investigators didn't care, but because they were overwhelmed. And now, decades later, we're trying to go back and fix those investigations, trying to apply current standards and technology to cases that were poorly worked in the first place. And it's hard. It's like trying to reverse engineer something when you're missing half the pieces. Searle Goldvogel's murder happened in a year when Denver saw significant violence. 1997 wasn't the worst year by any means, but it was bad enough that her case wasn't unique, wasn't the only elderly person attacked in their home that year, wasn't the only burglary that escalated to murder. And that context matters because it explains why the investigation didn't focus harder on Jonathan Clinton initially. They were chasing multiple leads across multiple cases, trying to figure out if crimes were connected, if there was a pattern, if one offender was responsible for multiple incidents. And in that chaos, things get missed. People fall through cracks. And by the time the dust settles and investigators can look at each case individually, the trail has gone cold. Witnesses have moved or died, evidence has degraded, and you're left with a much harder problem than if you'd solved it fresh. The emotional landscape of cold case families is unique and particularly cruel, because families of victims in recently solved murders go through an intense period of grief and trauma and trial proceedings, and then eventually, hopefully, some measure of healing and moving forward. But families of cold case victims never get that resolution. They're stuck in the acute phase of grief indefinitely. Every birthday and holiday and anniversary is a reminder not just that their loved one is dead, but that their killer is out there somewhere unpunished. And that's psychologically devastating. It prevents healing, it keeps wounds open. It creates this constant background radiation of injustice and uncertainty that colors everything. And when a cold case finally gets solved, when families finally get answers, they often describe it as being able to breathe again for the first time in years or decades, as if they'd been holding their breath waiting for this moment. And the relief is profound even when justice is incomplete. The Goldfogle family's specific reference to 7,000 sunrises, to counting the days of not knowing, speaks to how consuming this uncertainty becomes, how it structures time itself. You stop thinking about years passing and start thinking about individual days accumulating. Each one another day without answers. Another day the killer remains unidentified. Another day of waking up into the same nightmare. And 7,000 days is more than 19 years. They counted from Searle's murder in January 1997 to the resolution in January 2015. Every single day logged and felt and endured, and that precision, that counting, tells you how hyper-aware they were of time passing, how desperate they were for resolution, how much mental energy they devoted to just surviving the not knowing. And when I read that in their statement, my heart broke, because you can feel the weight of every single one of those days. Jonathan Clinton's death in 2003 from a heroin overdose raises uncomfortable questions about whether addiction was partially driven by guilt over the murder, whether he was self-medicating to escape the memory of what he'd done, whether his mother's decision to protect him rather than make him face consequences ultimately enabled his spiral into fatal addiction. And we'll never know the answers to those questions, but they're worth asking because they highlight how covering up a murder doesn't actually protect anyone. It just spreads the damage outward in concentric circles. It destroyed Searle's life, obviously, and devastated her family and traumatized the neighborhood and consumed Jonathan with guilt that may have contributed to killing him and turned his mother into a criminal and an accomplice and left her living with that knowledge until finally, 18 years later, she couldn't carry it anymore. And all of that damage traces back to that one moment when Searle came home and surprised a burglar, and he made the worst possible decision. The specifics of how Jonathan killed Searle, that he punched her and she fell, and then he kept beating her. That tells you something about how these situations escalate beyond what the perpetrator initially intended. Because Jonathan didn't break into that house planning to kill anyone. He was there to steal jewelry, to grab whatever he could fence for drug money. It was supposed to be a simple burglary. But then Searle came home, and she knew who he was, lived right across the street, and would recognize him immediately. And in that moment of panic, he made a split-second decision to silence the witness, to make sure she couldn't identify him. And that decision probably took 3 seconds. 3 seconds to go from burglar to murderer. 3 seconds to destroy multiple lives, including his own. And that's how most murders happen. They're not these carefully planned crimes. They're moments of rage or fear or panic where someone crosses a line they can never uncross. And then they have to live with it or die with it or confess to it or get caught for it. And there's no taking it back, no reset button. No way to undo those 3 seconds. The impact of genetic genealogy on cold case work can't be overstated because it's fundamentally changed what's solvable. Cases that were completely dead, no suspects, no leads, nothing except unidentified DNA, are now crackable. You can take that DNA and work backward through family trees until you narrow it down to a specific person. And the success rate is remarkable. Dozens of high-profile cases solved using this technique just in the last few years. And every success encourages more jurisdictions to invest in it, creates more pressure to solve old cases, gives families new hope that maybe their case will be next. But it also raises privacy concerns because the DNA databases being used are commercial genealogy sites where people voluntarily uploaded their DNA expecting to find relatives, not expecting their genetic information to be used to solve crimes. And there's a legitimate debate about whether that's an acceptable use, whether law enforcement should have access to that data, whether the crime-solving benefits outweigh the privacy implications. And society hasn't really resolved that debate yet. We're just moving forward with the technology faster than we're thinking through the ethics. The future of cold case investigation will likely involve artificial intelligence, analyzing patterns across thousands of cases to identify connections human investigators might miss. Predictive algorithms suggesting which suspects to focus on based on behavioral patterns and geographic analysis. Facial recognition technology, identifying suspects from old surveillance footage or photographs. But all of that technology is only as good as the data it's trained on and the humans interpreting its results. And there's real danger in over-relying on algorithms that might embed biases or make mistakes. Real danger in letting technology replace human judgment rather than augment it. And we need to be thoughtful about how we deploy these tools, need to maintain skepticism and oversight, need to remember that at the end of the day, we're trying to bring justice to real people whose lives were destroyed by violence. And that requires empathy and wisdom and judgment that no algorithm can provide. Searle Goldfogle was by all accounts a remarkable woman, descended from Denver pioneer families, which means her ancestors helped build the city in its earliest days. Active in her community despite health challenges, fiercely independent, living life on her own terms. And she deserved to grow old gracefully, deserved to see her grandchildren grow up, deserved to volunteer at the hospital and get her hair done with her sister and drive around Denver at midnight if that's what she wanted to do. And Jonathan Clinton took all of that away in those 3 seconds of violence. Took her future and her family's future and his own future. And even though he's dead and can't be punished, even though his mother escaped prosecution, even though there was no trial and no conviction and no formal justice, the truth finally came out. Searle's family finally knows what happened. Finally knows who killed her and why. Finally has answers after 7,000 sunrises of waiting. And maybe that's not justice in the legal sense, but it's something. It's acknowledgement. It's the truth being spoken aloud after 18 years of silence. And sometimes that's all we can get. Sometimes that has to be enough. The lesson from the Goldfogle case, if there is one, is that silence protects killers. That every person who knows something about a crime and stays quiet is extending the suffering of victims' families, is potentially enabling that killer to hurt others, is choosing comfort over justice. And while that choice is understandable, while loyalty and fear and apathy are human responses, they're also choices with consequences. And if you know something about a crime, any crime, cold or recent, you have an obligation to come forward. Not a legal obligation necessarily, but a moral one. Because somewhere there's a family counting sunrises, counting days without answers, living in that terrible limbo. And you could end that with a phone call, with a conversation with police, with the simple act of telling what you know. And yes, it's scary, And yes, there might be consequences, and yes, it might cost you relationships or safety. But weigh that against what victims' families are living with. Weigh it against justice delayed for years or decades. Weigh it against your own conscience. And make the right choice. Denver's cold case unit continues its work, continues pulling files off shelves, continues applying new technology to old evidence, continues refusing to forget the victims whose murders went unsolved. And every case they close is a victory for justice delayed but not denied. Every family they give answers to is one less family living in that terrible uncertainty. And the work continues because murder has no statute of limitations, and neither does the obligation to pursue justice. And as technology improves and techniques advance and resources hopefully increase, more cases will be solved, more families will get closure, more killers will be identified even if they can't always be prosecuted. And that matters. That work matters. Those families matter. Those victims matter. Zurla Goldvogel mattered, and we will never forget. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.